The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook Canyon as 18-year-old Emma Rodriguez swept the front porch of her family's general store. The small Arizona town had been her entire world since birth, nestled between red rock formations that rose like ancient sentinels against the endless blue sky. Her father, Miguel Rodriguez, had built their modest business from nothing after arriving from Mexico 20 years earlier, and Emma had grown up measuring flour, counting change, and listening to the gossip that flowed through their store like water through a creek. Sheriff Bradley Hawthorne's polished boots announced his arrival before Emma even looked up from her sweeping. At 42, Hawthorne commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout Millbrook Canyon. His badge gleamed against his pressed uniform, and his steely gray eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the town he controlled with an iron fist. Behind him walked his deputy, a nervous young man named Tommy Fletcher who seemed to jump at his own shadow whenever the sheriff was around. "Morning, Emma," Hawthorne said, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Emma continued sweeping, not meeting his gaze. "Sheriff Hawthorne, what brings you by so early?" Can't a man pay his respects to the prettiest girl in town without having an ulterior motive? He stepped closer, and Emma caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with tobacco. "Though now that you mention it, I did want to discuss something important with you and your father." The bell above the store's entrance chimed as Miguel Rodriguez emerged, wiping his hands on his apron. At 55, Miguel carried himself with quiet dignity despite the hardships that had weathered his face and grayed his hair. He had learned long ago to be cautious around men like Hawthorne, especially when they concerned themselves with his daughter. "Sheriff," Miguel nodded respectfully, "how can we help you?" Hawthorne's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect. "Miguel, my friend, I've been thinking a lot about Emma lately. She's grown into quite a remarkable young woman, and I believe it's time she had a man who could provide for her properly. Give her the life she deserves." Emma's grip tightened on the broom handle. She had been dreading this conversation for months, ever since she'd noticed Hawthorne's lingering stares and unnecessary visits to their store. The sheriff was a widower whose wife had died under mysterious circumstances 3 years earlier, and the whispers around town suggested that Martha Hawthorne's death hadn't been as accidental as the official report claimed. "Emma is still very young," Miguel said carefully, his English carrying the slight accent that marked him as an outsider in some people's eyes. "She has plenty of time to think about marriage." 18 is hardly young by frontier standards," Hawthorne countered, his tone growing sharper. "Besides, I'm not getting any younger myself, and I need a wife who can help me maintain my position in this community." Emma would make an excellent sheriff's wife. The presumption in his words made Emma's stomach turn. I'm not interested in marriage right now, Sheriff Hawthorne. I have plans to continue my education, maybe even travel to Phoenix or Tucson. Hawthorne's expression darkened at her direct refusal. In his world, young women didn't speak so boldly to men in positions of authority, especially not Mexican girls who should be grateful for the attention of someone like him. Now, Emma, don't be hasty. Think about what I'm offering you. Security, respect, a fine house on the hill. Your children would have opportunities that most folks in this town could never dream of. My answer is no, Emma said firmly, meeting his gaze for the first time. I appreciate your interest, but I won't be marrying you or anyone else right now. The silence that followed was deafening. Deputy Fletcher shifted uncomfortably behind Hawthorne, while Miguel stepped protectively closer to his daughter. The sheriff's jaw clenched, and his hand instinctively moved toward the pistol at his hip before he caught himself. I see, Hawthorne said slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Well, perhaps you need some time to think about this decision more carefully. Sometimes young people don't fully understand the consequences of their choices until it's too late. The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories about what happened to people who crossed Sheriff Hawthorne, businesses that suddenly faced impossible tax assessments, families who found themselves accused of crimes they didn't commit, and individuals who simply disappeared without explanation. There's nothing to think about, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her chest. My answer won't change. Hawthorne studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing every detail for future reference. Then he smiled again, but this time the expression held no warmth whatsoever. We'll see about that, Miss Rodriguez. We'll see about that. As the sheriff and his deputy walked away, Emma watched their retreating figures with growing unease. She had heard the stories too, whispered conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room, tales of Martha Hawthorne's bruises that she'd tried to hide, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding her death from a fall down the stairs. That evening, as Emma helped her father close the store, she noticed how his hands shook slightly as he counted the day's receipts. The confrontation with Hawthorne had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, and Emma felt guilty for bringing this trouble to their door. Papa, maybe I should have been more diplomatic, she said softly. I didn't mean to make things difficult for us. Miguel looked up from the ledger and smiled at his daughter with fierce pride. You did nothing wrong, Mija. A woman should never have to marry a man she doesn't love, especially not one like him. We'll find a way through this. But even as he spoke the words, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. Sheriff Bradley Hawthorne was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his control over Millbrook Canyon was absolute. The Rodriguez family had just made a powerful enemy, and in a town where the sheriff's word was law, that could prove to be a fatal mistake. Outside, the desert wind began to howl through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of storms to come. Emma pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried not to think about the cold calculation she had seen in Hawthorne's eyes. She had no way of knowing that her refusal had set in motion a chain of events that would forever change not only her life, but the entire town of Millbrook Canyon. The next morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over the Rodriguez household like a suffocating blanket. Emma woke to find her father already dressed and packing the kitchen, his coffee growing cold as he stared out the window toward the sheriff's office across the street. "He's been there since dawn," Miguel muttered, gesturing toward the silhouette visible in the office window. "Just watching our store." Emma joined her father at the window and felt her stomach drop. Sheriff Hawthorne sat motionless behind his desk, his gaze fixed on their building with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Even from this distance, she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence. The morning passed slowly, with fewer customers than usual visiting the store. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly through the small town's gossip network, and people were beginning to choose sides. Some, particularly the newer residents and those with something to hide, maintained their loyalty to the sheriff. Others, mostly the Mexican families and longtime residents who remembered what Millbrook Canyon was like before Hawthorne's rise to power, quietly showed their support for the Rodriguez family by continuing to shop there despite the obvious risks. Around midday, Mrs. Catherine Walsh entered the store with her usual list of supplies. The 60-year-old widow had been one of the town's founding families and possessed a sharp tongue that even Hawthorne was cautious about crossing. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her weathered hands spoke of decades spent working her small ranch on the outskirts of town. "Emma, dear," she said loudly enough for anyone listening to hear, "I wanted to tell you how proud I am of you for standing up for yourself yesterday. It takes real courage to face down a bully, especially one wearing a badge." Emma glanced nervously toward the window where Hawthorne's silhouette remained visible. "Mrs. Walsh, maybe you shouldn't." "Shouldn't what? Speak the truth." Catherine's voice rose even higher. "I've lived in this town for 40 years, and I remember when decent people could walk these streets without fear. Bradley Hawthorne has turned our community into his own personal kingdom, and it's about time someone had the backbone to tell him no." The old woman's words carried clearly through the thin walls, and Emma was certain that Hawthorne could hear every syllable. Mrs. Walsh seemed to relish the attention, her defiant stance making it clear that she had no intention of backing down from a fight. You just remember, child, Catherine continued, placing a weathered hand on Emma's arm. You're not alone in this. There are more good people in this town than bad ones, even if the bad ones have all the power right now. After Mrs. Walsh left with her purchases, Emma felt a mixture of gratitude and terror. The old woman's support meant everything to her, but it also meant that the conflict was spreading beyond her family. Other people were now at risk because of her decision to refuse the sheriff's proposal. That afternoon brought a visit from Jake Morrison, a struggling rancher whose property bordered the eastern edge of town. At 26, Jake had inherited his family's ranch after his parents died in a flu epidemic 2 years earlier. The spread had been barely profitable even when his father was alive, and Jake had been fighting a losing battle against debt, drought, and the larger ranchers who seemed determined to drive him out of business. Jake was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands that spoke of long days working under the brutal Arizona sun. His clothes were clean but well-worn, and his hat showed the signs of countless hours spent in the saddle. Despite his financial struggles, he carried himself with quiet dignity and possessed an honesty that was increasingly rare in Millbrook Canyon. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, removing his hat as he entered the store. "I wanted to buy some supplies and, well, I also wanted to say that I think you did the right thing yesterday." Emma looked up from the inventory she was counting, surprised by the unexpected support. She had spoken to Jake Morrison only a handful of times over the years, usually when he came to town for supplies or to conduct business at the bank. He was known as a man of few words who kept to himself and worked harder than anyone else in the county. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," she replied softly. "That means a lot, especially coming from you." Jake nodded and began gathering the items he needed: flour, coffee, ammunition, and other basic supplies that kept a working ranch operational. As he moved through the store, Emma noticed how carefully he calculated each purchase, clearly operating on a tight budget that left little room for extras. "Times are tough out at the ranch," Jake said, as if reading her thoughts. "But they'll get better. They have to." There was something in his voice that suggested he was talking about more than just his financial situation. Emma watched as he paid for his purchases with carefully counted coins, leaving barely enough change for a cup of coffee at the diner. "Mr. Morrison," she said impulsively as he prepared to leave, "if you ever need credit for supplies, my father and I would be happy to work something out. We know you're good for it." Jake paused at the door and turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "That's very kind of you, Miss Rodriguez, but I make it a point to pay my debts as I go. A man's word is about all he has left when everything else is taken away." After Jake left, Emma found herself thinking about his words and the quiet strength she had seen in his eyes. There was something reassuring about his presence, a sense of solid reliability that was increasingly rare in their uncertain world. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in the calm before a terrible storm. Sheriff Hawthorne had remained at his post across the street, watching and waiting with the patience of a man who held all the cards. As evening approached and Emma helped her father close the store, she wondered what form his retaliation would take and how long they would have to wait to find out. That night, Emma lay awake listening to the desert wind and thinking about the choice she had made. Part of her wondered if she should have been more diplomatic, found a way to refuse Hawthorne's proposal without creating such obvious hostility. But another part of her, the part that had inherited her father's stubborn pride and her late mother's fierce independence, knew that she had done the only thing she could do while still being able to look at herself in the mirror. Whatever came next, Emma Rodriguez was determined to face it with her head held high and her principles intact. She had no way of knowing that her courage would soon be tested in ways she never could have imagined, or that help would come from the most unexpected source when she needed it most. The third day after Emma's refusal brought the first sign of Sheriff Hawthorne's retaliation. Miguel Rodriguez arrived at the store that morning to find a notice nailed to the front door, its official seal gleaming in the early sunlight like a badge of authority. With trembling hands, he removed the document and read its contents, his face growing paler with each word. "Emma," he called, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Come here, please." Emma emerged from the back room where she had been organizing inventory, taking one look at her father's expression before her stomach dropped. "What is it, Papa?" Miguel handed her the notice without speaking. The document, signed with Sheriff Hawthorne's distinctive flourish, informed them that the Rodriguez General Store was being investigated for suspected tax evasion, and that all business operations must cease immediately pending a full audit of their records. The investigation, according to the notice, could take anywhere from several weeks to several months to complete. "This is impossible," Emma breathed, reading the document twice to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. "Our taxes are current. You've kept meticulous records for 20 years. "Of course they are," Miguel replied bitterly. "But that doesn't matter when the person conducting the investigation is the same person who wants to punish us." The implications of the closure were devastating. The store was their only source of income, and without it, they would be unable to pay their rent, buy food, or maintain their modest lifestyle. Worse yet, the forced closure would damage their reputation in the community, making it difficult to rebuild their customer base even if they were eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. Word of the store's closure spread through Millbrook Canyon like wildfire. By noon, a small crowd had gathered outside the building, some people expressing sympathy and support, others maintaining careful distance to avoid being associated with the Rodriguez family's troubles. The division in the community was becoming more apparent with each passing hour. Mrs. Catherine Walsh arrived shortly after lunch, her face flushed with indignation. "This is outrageous," she declared loudly enough for the entire street to hear. "Everyone in this town knows that Miguel Rodriguez is the most honest businessman we've ever had. This is nothing but petty revenge, and we all know it." Her words drew murmurs of agreement from some of the gathered crowd. But Emma noticed how many people remained silent or began to drift away rather than voice their opinions publicly. Fear was a powerful motivator in a town where one man held so much authority. That afternoon, Jake Morrison appeared at the store's locked entrance, his expression grim as he read the notice that had replaced the usual open sign. Emma watched from the window as he stood there for several minutes, his jaw clenched with what appeared to be barely contained anger. When Emma opened the door to speak with him, Jake removed his hat and looked directly into her eyes. "This is wrong," he said simply. "Everyone knows it's wrong." "Knowing it and being able to do something about it are two different things," Emma replied, her voice heavy with resignation. "Sheriff Hawthorne holds all the power in this town." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying the locked door and the official notice with its intimidating government seal. When he spoke again, his voice carried a determination that surprised Emma with its intensity. "Power isn't everything," he said. "Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who's willing to lose everything for what's right." That evening, as Emma and Miguel sat in their small apartment above the store trying to figure out how they would survive the forced closure, they heard a commotion in the street below. Looking out their window, they saw Jake Morrison's wagon parked outside, loaded with supplies from other towns and cities. A hand-painted sign attached to the wagon read, "Fresh goods, fair prices." Jake had set up an impromptu market right in front of their closed store, selling the kinds of supplies that people typically bought from the Rodriguez General Store. But instead of keeping the profits for himself, he was using the venture to collect donations for the Rodriguez family, quietly passing envelopes of money to Miguel whenever Sheriff Hawthorne wasn't watching. The gesture was both touching and dangerous. By supporting the Rodriguez family so publicly, Jake was making himself a target for Hawthorne's retaliation. Everyone in town understood the risks he was taking, which made his actions all the more remarkable. Sheriff Hawthorne appeared within an hour, his face dark with anger as he surveyed Jake's unauthorized market. Deputy Fletcher flanked him nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating conflict, but too afraid of his boss to voice any objections. "Morrison," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge, You don't have a permit to operate a business on this street." Jake looked up from the scales where he was weighing flour for Mrs. Walsh, his expression calm despite the obvious threat. "I'm not operating a business, Sheriff. I'm just sharing supplies with my neighbors. Last I checked, that wasn't against any law." "Don't get smart with me, boy," Hawthorne snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "I could shut you down and arrest you for a dozen different violations." "You could try," Jake replied evenly, straightening to his full height. At 6 feet 2 inches, he was several inches taller than the sheriff, and his years of ranch work had given him a physical presence that commanded respect. "But then you'd have to explain to everyone why you're arresting a man for helping his neighbors." The tension in the street was palpable as the two men faced each other. Emma watched from her window, her heart pounding as she realized that Jake Morrison was deliberately putting himself in harm's way to help her family. The courage of his actions both humbled and terrified her. Mrs. Walsh broke the standoff by stepping between the two men, her arms loaded with purchases from Jake's wagon. "Sheriff Hawthorne," she said sweetly, "I do hope you're not planning to interfere with legitimate commerce. The territorial governor takes a very dim view of officials who abuse their authority to settle personal grudges." The mention of higher authority gave Hawthorne pause. Mrs. Walsh had connections throughout the territory, and her complaints carried weight in circles far beyond Millbrook Canyon. Backing down from this confrontation might look like weakness, but escalating it could bring unwanted scrutiny from territorial officials who might not appreciate his methods. After a long moment, Hawthorne stepped back, his expression promising future retribution even as he chose tactical retreat for the moment. "Just make sure you follow all applicable laws, Morrison. I'd hate to see you get into trouble over a misunderstanding." As the sheriff and his deputy walked away, Jake continued serving customers as if nothing had happened. But Emma could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes tracked Hawthorne's movements until the lawman disappeared around the corner. That night, after Jake had packed up his wagon and returned to his ranch, Emma found herself thinking about his quiet courage and unwavering principles. In a town where most people were too afraid to stand up to Sheriff Hawthorne, Jake Morrison had risked everything to help her family without asking for anything in return. She also couldn't stop thinking about Hawthorne's expression when he had been forced to back down. The sheriff was a man accustomed to absolute authority, and having his power challenged in public would not be something he would forget or forgive easily. Emma realized that both her family and Jake Morrison were now living on borrowed time, waiting for Hawthorne to devise a response that would eliminate his opposition once and for all. The next morning brought news that sent shockwaves through the entire community. Jake Morrison's ranch house had burned to the ground during the night, taking with it everything he owned except for the livestock he had managed to drive to safety. The official investigation, conducted by Sheriff Hawthorne himself, concluded that the fire had been caused by a defective chimney, but everyone in town knew the truth. Emma stared at the smoke still rising from the distant ranch, her hands clenched into fists as rage and helplessness warred in her chest. Jake had lost everything because he had tried to help her family, and there was nothing she could do to make it right. The message from Sheriff Hawthorne was clear. This was what happened to people who opposed him. But if Hawthorne thought that destroying Jake's home would break the rancher's spirit, he had seriously underestimated his opponent. By evening, Jake had set up camp in the ruins of his property, determined to rebuild despite having no insurance money and precious little savings to finance the effort. Emma knew that the conflict was escalating beyond anything she had imagined when she first refused Hawthorne's proposal. The sheriff was systematically destroying everyone who supported her family, and she was beginning to wonder if her refusal to marry him was worth the suffering it was causing others. The fourth day brought an escalation that nobody in Millbrook Canyon had anticipated. Emma woke to the sound of urgent knocking on the apartment door, followed by her father's hushed conversation with someone in the hallway. When she emerged from her bedroom, she found Miguel speaking with Tommy Fletcher, Sheriff Hawthorne's nervous young deputy. Fletcher looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. His uniform was wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he accepted the cup of coffee that Miguel offered him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Miss Rodriguez," he began, glancing nervously toward the window, "I need to warn you about something. The sheriff, he's planning something terrible. Tonight." Emma felt her blood turn to ice. What kind of something? Fletcher swallowed hard, clearly struggling with his conscience. "He's been drinking heavily since yesterday, talking about how you and Morrison have made him look weak in front of the whole town. He says he needs to send a message that nobody will ever forget." "What message?" Miguel demanded, his protective instincts fully aroused. "He's planning to arrest you, Miss Rodriguez, on false charges. Says he'll claim you were conspiring with Morrison to defraud the government. But that's not the worst part." Fletcher's voice dropped even lower. "I heard him talking to some of his friends, men who aren't officially deputies but who do his dirty work when he needs something that can't be traced back to him. They're planning to make sure you never make it to trial." The implications of his words hit Emma like a physical blow. Hawthorne wasn't just planning to frame her for crimes she didn't commit. He was planning to have her killed while supposedly resisting arrest or attempting to escape. It was the perfect solution from his perspective. It would eliminate his problem while making him look like a hero who died protecting the community from dangerous criminals. "Why are you telling us this?" Emma asked, studying Fletcher's face for any sign of deception. The young deputy looked up at her with eyes full of shame and regret. Because I became a lawman to protect people, not to help a corrupt sheriff murder innocent girls. I can't be part of this anymore. Miguel began packing the small room, his mind racing as he tried to process this information and formulate a plan. We need to leave town immediately. Tonight, before he can put his plan into action. Where would we go? Emma asked. He has connections throughout the territory. His reach extends far beyond Millbrook Canyon. The territorial capital, Fletcher suggested. Governor Murphy has been getting reports about Hawthorne's methods. If you could reach Phoenix and tell your story to the right people. But even as he spoke the words, they all knew how unlikely it was that Emma would be able to make such a journey safely. The roads between Millbrook Canyon and Phoenix were dangerous even under the best circumstances, and traveling alone would make her an easy target for Hawthorne's men. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses approaching echoed from the street below. Emma moved to the window and peered through the curtains, her heart sinking as she saw Sheriff Hawthorne and 4 other men positioning themselves around the building. 2 of the men were strangers to her, rough-looking individuals who wore their guns with the casual confidence of professional killers. "He's here," she whispered, backing away from the window. "It's too late to run." Fletcher cursed under his breath and stood up, his hand moving to his own weapon. Maybe not. There might be another way. Before anyone could ask what he meant, Fletcher moved to the window and called down to the street. "Sheriff, I've got them secured up here. Why don't you come up and we can finish this quietly?" Hawthorne's voice drifted up from below, filled with approval. "Good work, Fletcher. I knew I could count on you." As they heard boots on the stairs, Fletcher turned to Emma and Miguel with desperate urgency. "There's a back stairway that leads to the alley behind the store. When I give the signal, run for Jake Morrison's place. He's the only one who might be able to help you now." "But what about you?" Emma asked, realizing that Fletcher was essentially signing his own death warrant by betraying Hawthorne. "I'll buy you as much time as I can," Fletcher replied grimly. "It's the least I can do after being part of this for so long." The deputy positioned himself at the apartment door just as Hawthorne's heavy footsteps reached the landing. Emma grabbed her father's hand, and they moved toward the back of the apartment, their hearts pounding as they prepared to run for their lives. "Sheriff," Fletcher called through the door, "they're asking to speak with you alone. They say they have information about Morrison's activities that might interest you." There was a pause, then Hawthorne's voice, thick with suspicion and alcohol. "Open the door, Fletcher." As the deputy reached for the door handle, he looked back at Emma one last time. "Run," he mouthed silently, "and don't look back." The back stairway was narrow and steep, and Emma stumbled twice in her haste to reach the alley below. Behind them, they could hear the apartment door opening and Hawthorne's voice growing louder as he realized he had been deceived. Fletcher's voice rose in response, and then there was the sound of a scuffle followed by a gunshot that echoed through the night like thunder. Emma and Miguel ran through the darkened streets of Millbrook Canyon, avoiding the main roads and using every shortcut they had learned during their years in the town. Behind them, more gunshots rang out, and Emma tried not to think about what they meant for Deputy Fletcher's chances of survival. The Morrison Ranch was several miles outside of town, and the journey on foot seemed to take forever. Emma's lungs burned from the unaccustomed exertion, and she could hear her father's labored breathing as he struggled to keep up despite his age and the stress of their situation. When they finally reached the ruins of Jake's ranch house, they found him sitting by a small campfire, a rifle across his knees as if he had been expecting them. He looked up at their approach, taking in their disheveled appearance and obvious distress with a single glance. They came for you," he said simply. "It wasn't a question." Emma nodded, too exhausted and emotionally drained to speak. Miguel managed to gasp out the essential details of Fletcher's warning and their narrow escape, while Emma sank to the ground beside the fire and tried to process everything that had happened. Jake listened to their story without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Miguel finished speaking, the rancher stood up and walked to the edge of his property, staring back toward the town where lights were now moving in search patterns that suggested a manhunt in progress. "They'll be here soon," he said matter-of-factly. "Hawthorne knows you don't have anywhere else to go." "Then we're trapped," Emma said quietly. "There's nowhere left to run." Jake turned back to face them, and in the firelight, Emma could see something in his eyes that she had never noticed before, a quiet strength that went far deeper than mere physical courage. This was a man who had been tested by life and had emerged with his principles intact. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back." As if to emphasize his words, the distant sound of approaching horses drifted across the desert night. Sheriff Hawthorne and his men were coming, and Emma realized that the next few hours would determine not only her fate, but the future of everyone who had dared to stand against corruption in Millbrook Canyon. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew steadily louder as Sheriff Hawthorne and his posse closed in on Jake Morrison's burned-out ranch. Emma crouched behind the stone foundation of what had once been Jake's barn, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her father and Jake make their final preparations for what seemed like an impossible fight. Jake had armed Miguel with an old Winchester rifle and positioned him behind the remains of the ranch house's chimney, the only structure that had survived the fire. The rancher himself had taken up position near the well, his own rifle loaded and ready. In the pale moonlight, Emma could see the grim determination on both men's faces as they prepared to defend her against overwhelming odds. "Miss Rodriguez," Jake called softly, "there's a root cellar about 50 yards behind where you're hiding. If things go badly, you get yourself down there and don't come out until you're sure it's safe." Emma shook her head, even though she knew he probably couldn't see the gesture in the darkness. "I won't abandon you, not after everything you've done for us." "This isn't about abandonment," Jake replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "This is about making sure that someone survives to tell the story of what happened here tonight." The hoofbeats were very close now, and Emma could see the flickering light of torches moving across the desert toward their position. Hawthorne had brought at least 6 men with him, possibly more, and they were spread out in a formation designed to surround the ranch and prevent any escape. Sheriff Hawthorne's voice boomed across the night, amplified by alcohol and rage. "Jake Morrison, send out the girl and the Mexican, and nobody else has to get hurt tonight." Jake's response was calm and measured, carrying clearly across the open ground. "The only person who's going to get hurt tonight is anyone who tries to harm innocent people, Hawthorne." "Innocent?" Hawthorne's laugh was harsh and bitter. "That girl has caused nothing but trouble since the day she was born. Her and her family don't belong in this town, and it's time they learned their place." The racist hatred in his words made Emma's stomach churn, but it also crystallized something important in her mind. This wasn't really about her refusal to marry him. That had simply been the trigger for violence that had been building for years. Hawthorne's corruption and prejudice had been poisoning Millbrook Canyon long before she had ever caught his attention. "The only person who doesn't belong here is you, Hawthorne," Jake shouted back. "This territory was built by people who came here looking for a better life, not by thugs who hide behind badges while they terrorize honest families." The exchange was interrupted by the crack of a rifle shot that sent splinters flying from the wooden post near Jake's head. One of Hawthorne's men had grown impatient with the talking and decided to open the fighting on his own initiative. What followed was the kind of chaotic gunfight that Emma had only read about in dime novels, but the reality was far more terrifying than any fictional account. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireworks, and the sharp reports of rifle fire echoed off the canyon walls in a continuous thunder that seemed to go on forever. Jake proved to be as skilled with a rifle as he was with everything else, and his shots found their marks with devastating accuracy. Within the first few minutes of the fight, 2 of Hawthorne's men were down, and the others had taken cover behind rocks and sagebrush as they realized they were facing more opposition than they had expected. Miguel fought with the desperate courage of a father protecting his child, and his shots helped keep the attackers pinned down even, though his marksmanship wasn't as precise as Jake's. But Emma could see that the older man was struggling with the physical demands of the firefight, and she knew that he wouldn't be able to maintain this level of activity for very long. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Emma watched in horror as bullets whined past her hiding place, some of them striking the stone foundation with showers of sparks that illuminated the night in brief, terrifying flashes. Then disaster struck. A lucky shot from one of Hawthorne's men caught Miguel in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. Emma heard her father cry out in pain and started to run toward him, only to be stopped by Jake's urgent shout. "Stay down, I'll get to him." But as Jake moved to help Miguel, Sheriff Hawthorne saw his opportunity. The corrupt lawman rose from his concealment with a pistol in each hand, his face twisted with rage and madness as he advanced on the wounded man. "This ends now," Hawthorne roared, both guns aimed at Miguel's prone form. "I'll kill every one of you if that's what it takes." Emma watched in horror as Hawthorne's fingers tightened on the triggers. Her father was helpless. Jake was too far away to intervene, and in seconds Miguel Rodriguez would be dead. Without thinking, Emma broke from her hiding place and ran toward the sheriff, screaming at the top of her lungs.